Hello and welcome to the Life Made Mobile podcast from Waracle, a conversation about digital culture, digital strategy, digital business transformation. Every 2 weeks, we dissect a couple of hot topics in the industry, or we speak to a guest who will discuss the world of mobile, data, and emerging technology through the lens of healthcare or financial services. For those of you who don't know Waracle, we are 350 plus talented technologists across strategy, product, research, design, development, and optimization. We aim to make lives better with mobile technologies. So we specialize in partnering with enterprise organizations to deliver innovation spikes or large programs of work and collaboratively deliver tangible business value through software development. With me today, as has been on a number of these podcasts, is my friend and colleague, David Lowe. Hey, David.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or wherever you are.
And every time we set ourselves the challenge of getting under 30 minutes, and every time we fail miserably. But last time we failed less miserably, where we were 32 minutes. And so this time when we upload this one, I'm going to be really proud of us, David, when we come in at 29:59. Okay?
Challenge set.
Challenge set. So we're going to be talking about two topics today. One, I suppose, a reasonably current news story, and one slightly more navel gazing, slightly more thinking about a particular topic and a particular use of terminology. The first one sits firmly in the healthcare space, and I will just launch into it and ask you your opinion. So from a filing in mid-October, we know that Best Buy, a consumer electronics company in the US, has acquired Current Health. Until I read the press release, I didn't know that this is actually their third company that they've acquired in the healthcare space. You and I were having a conversation the other day, and you mentioned on Slack that you're still somewhat perplexed by the move. Can you give me some of your thoughts straight off the bat as to why you are still not sure the sort of angle that they're looking for?
Well, I've since we talked about it, it's maybe started to fall into place, but inherently you can't quite understand why a company that sells headphones and hoovers would buy somebody who's heavily into telemedicine. Those two things just don't square. It felt a little bit like when media companies bought Friends Reunited. I never quite understand, and 15 years later I still don't understand. Or when I think it was Fox bought MySpace. Given what the company was at the time, I guess they were thinking ahead, but at the time it didn't and never will fit. So it felt like oil and water a little bit, but let's dive into it and see there may actually be something in this the more we talk about it.
And so it's interesting. I suppose that in my research, when I was looking into it, I read that Current Health's owners said that their focus and purpose around their business was to facilitate the shift from in-facility healthcare to in-home healthcare and make it radically easier for healthcare providers to realize that aspiration in home. And suppose that if we presume that in-home healthcare means both devices, software, connectivity, you can kind of start to see where the two kind of marry up potentially, yeah.
Well, actually, so the more I start to look at it, I think there was a chief executive of Best Buy said healthcare will never be virtual because it can't be. And that sort of reset my head straight away. You know, right. If the in-home bit I kind of get, but I'd thought about it as a digital teleservice, something like that, because that's what it's largely been the last year. But they said it's inherently physical, and human healthcare always will have a physical element. It just at some stage it has to, in the progress of care, I guess. And then if you take that premise differently, it's logistics and supply chains, and that's apparently what Best Buy told its investors it will apply to this. So I guess by extension, what you might think is who's next. Not so much the Current Health bit, because there's dozens of companies in that space. Where do Amazon enter it? Because if it's logistics and supply chain and margin, ultimately that's where they enter. So at what point does the next company get bought by Walmart, or Amazon or something? They're all making interesting acquisitions on the fly. But that makes a lot more sense all of a sudden if it is about the provisioning of things to people's houses to enable healthcare for somebody to visit that isn't in a practice, but still have some means of delivering physical healthcare. That suddenly adds up, and I hadn't really thought through that, to be honest.
It's interesting. I remember a while ago sort of nerding out and going deep into American GDP and realizing just how much of American gross domestic product is made up of healthcare and arms. And when you read that information, you start to realize why a sort of Western military industrial complex has the kind of drive that it has, but also similarly, you understand why so many sort of organizations will try and acquire in the healthcare space, because it has and always will be a big driver of revenue, and you would imagine in a lot of cases high margin revenue. Is it a comment on Best Buy's core business that they're acquiring healthcare companies? Do you think that sort of consumer electronics world, like they're essentially trying to shore up their wider group model and P&L by acquiring in healthcare?
Possibly. They'll give themselves another slice of another market to go after. I mean, but I used to hear these debates about travel in my old life, and that the argument was always so many companies are try to be part of travel one way or the other, whether it's the retail around it or fulfillment or supply chain or whatever. And the argument was always that travel is 13% of the world's economy in various different forms. And health must be, I don't know the number, but health must be bigger than that, I would imagine. Given
I think
it is of the public spend,
Yeah, I mean, I from that deep dive, I think I remember reading that at one point it was 36% of American GDP. So, like you say, if you take that as a global figure, you're probably likely to be somewhere between a quarter and a third, you would guess.
Yeah, we've talked in the past, I'm sure we will often again, about how democratizing this stuff and actually giving people the ability to do things at home. We spent most of an hour talking about it in our health event last week. You could imagine a consumer electronics retail company being a good supplier of stuff like that. And if they're sort of in the market of both the provision of the healthcare and the provision of the means, the devices that eventually enable it, that starts to, as I say, it adds up a lot more than it did a few days ago before diving into it. So quite a clever early move. I don't think it's an unrealistic one now either, having sort of delved into it. When we talked about oil and water at the start, there are many things in the past which have been like that. Companies just buying companies because there might be value in it, but there was no strategic fit. AOL and Yahoo have been going through this for years, buying companies and then getting rid of them. This actually feels like it might operate in its own silo, but there'll be some sort of flywheel effect that health will apply to consumer tech and the other way back that actually adds value to both sides. So yeah, good on them.
Yeah, it's interesting. And obviously you mentioned the event that we ran last week, which was amazing, by the way. The structure of sort of future-facing patient experience seems to have this alignment with connected medical devices, with wearables, with patient engagement apps on their phone, with remote monitoring via video checkups, telehealth, and the like. Do you think that kind of connected health future will be expedited in countries that have private healthcare systems in comparison to countries that have public health care systems? Or do you think that that we'll see all of those health services moving in the same direction at the same pace?
No, I think they absolutely won't move at the same pace. We tried really hard in our event last week to stay out of politics, but there are some countries where clearly things happen slower than others, and it's surprising which they are. I mean, we've looked at things the last few months where in Germany they have quite a well-organized regulation and approval service for medical apps, which give people a self-reporting ability in a safe way and compliant way and all. It's not just GDPR and stuff, it's actually about patient experience too being what it should be. Where other countries, including the UK, are not that yet. It's getting somewhere, but there's no sort of European standard to it, probably because it would be even worse. Let's face it. So, because you'd be into lowest common denominators and all that. But you can imagine where private healthcare is more prevalent, there'd be a reason to do it. Where in this country, public provision is just a little bit different. So, yeah, you can imagine the US and where Best Buy comes in, less, not less regulation, but faster moving regulation might enable and unlock some of this stuff and show the rest of us what to do. We put the sort of posit to a couple of health people in our event last week that clearly in the last year there have been some moonshots, particularly in Britain. Actually, for vaccines emerged here before most other countries got them going, so it is possible when you want to. We just tried to figure out between us what the enabler would be for that to happen more often outside of an emergency. So if you can mobilize for COVID, you could presumably mobilize for other things as well if you wanted to. You had the means. Maybe it's just the means aren't there, but yeah, that's a whole hour on its own once you get into it. But
well, last question, I suppose, on this one would be then, there was news last week that NHS X will be sort of subsumed by the NHS digital sort of wider piece, and I suppose that the MO of NHS X was quite different in some respects, and maybe that organisation or arm of the NHS was seen to be sort of an opportunity to galvanise the kind of things that you're talking about. Do you think there's anything to read into that in terms of is that like a risk averse play to bring it back in, or was it just always going to occur that way post COVID?
Probably two aspects to that. Better be careful how we say this, but the NHSX team was originally set up to bring a bit of the valley to the NHS, and it sort of moved independently and outside of bureaucracy. And the sort of things that need to happen for that to work is you need to be able to break things and be wrong now and again, which in healthcare it's difficult, but as long as you do it early enough, it works. And the first thing that happened with that was the team tried to build a COVID app differently than others. And eventually, I think they had the brakes pulled on it by Apple and Google in terms of Bluetooth location tracking, okay. patient tracking and things like that. So they met a failure early, but there was instant criticism of it that you're sort of meddling with public health here. Yeah. Well, all they were trying to do was make something work better. And actually, if Google and Apple had played along, the thing they were trying to do was better because it worked, but didn't abuse the battery as much. They're just trying to push things a little bit and do it quicker. But they were knocked back for it. And that's where the media gets involved, and the Daily Mails of the world start to say, what are they doing? And I think there's a bit of a reaction to that. And they've been brought into the mothership of the NHS now, where they will move slower for sure. And it may just be to reassure people that the tech's not being abused and money's not being wasted, which is possibly headline grabbing. But you do wonder, they were actually, I did a little bit of work with NHSX last 2 years ago, just when it came about, and NHS Digital, they were actually trying really hard to move fast and try things. The APIs they built with symptom information and sort of self-help stuff were really good, well-written APIs available to anyone. The data was open. You could get a license for free, which isn't always the case. So it's a shame if that goes away, but I guess it's early days and we'll find out.
It's interesting as well, I suppose, the structure of these organisations when they're stood up, because I know a few ex-colleagues, a couple of whom work for agencies, a couple of whom work for pharma businesses, both in the UK and Europe, who were essentially seconded from their role into NHSX, but now seem to all be traversing back as well. So I suppose that part of that structure will have, have guided that kind of route back into the mothership, as you say. Yeah. Thank you so much for your opinions on that. It was a fascinating little discussion of the world of healthcare. We also had a somewhat interesting and funny set of calls and Slack messages about fintech recently, and I think that the thing that came out from them was that even though we all know the term fintech, we all broadly understand that it's a noun, we all broadly understand what sort of fits underneath that umbrella term, there still seems to be a bit of confusion around what a fintech is, if it even is a thing, if it's an umbrella term, and we think about it as a name used for a collection of startups, but also potentially use cases for a range of innovations. And I mean, obviously, you could go down a rabbit hole with this, but just for you personally, where do you see the distinction, and what would you class as a fintech?
So I'm a born contrarian. So let me set out the first part. So fintech is basically financial technology abbreviated, right? And so you can apply that to anything from mainframes to crypto and all points in between. So I thought, just to have some fun here, we would delve into Wikipedia and see what clearly somebody's put that there, because Wikipedia doesn't write itself. Technology and innovation that aims to compete with traditional financial methods in the delivery of financial services. Fair enough, I can get that. So if you take that definition, you could say in the 60s, mainframes competed with mechanical abacus machines and stuff like that, or tills, or whatever it might be. And that's perfectly true. And maybe fintech just moves over time. But it goes on to say, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but after reviewing 200 scientific papers citing the word fintech, a study on the definition of the word concluded fintech is a new financial industry that applies technology to improve financial activity.
Wow.
That feels a bit more like it. We should probably tweet the source of that, because there is a source applied to that, as there should be. That feels a lot more like it, and more nearer to what we talk about. So we talk about fintech to be the application of new things to make something better. Now, you can say that about the previous definition too, but new industry is interesting, and that's probably a better way to think about it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because like in my head, I worked as a teller in a bank for a number of years when I was at college and university, and you could argue that financial technology encompasses everything from the remittance machines through to the cash counters, and then right the way up to things like APIs facilitating banking as a service, and everything, as you said, in between. But I think that the way that most people use them is as a sort of collective noun for a group of businesses. So when people say fintechs, they think of Monzo, Revolut, Laka, Waggle, and I suppose that I suppose the way that I approach it is, I think to myself, are they the kind of organizations that are building to become the next, big four, or are they startups which are just going to be subsumed by the big four? And have the advent of these businesses sort of springing up really created actual competition in the kind of traditional financial services eyes? Or is it just that they essentially they've outsourced innovation to like a de-risked startup world? They're waiting to see who grows big enough, and then they're going to acquire them all via M&A.
I was thinking about this as well. So if you go back 30 years, maybe less, but 25, 30, you'd find the same arguments applied to telephony banks. We've talked about this a lot in-house, that in the 90s, you might have had First Direct, Intelligent Finance, Kahoot, and spin-outs like that tried to spin things out, egg and credit cards, these people. They eventually got subsumed into motherships eventually for reasons of scale, and now they kind of don't exist other than brands. Some of the brands don't exist. They just got completely swallowed up. So you have to wonder if the same thing applies again, because these competitors come into the market through technology and have investment that needs paid back. So eventually that has to run its course, and the only people with the money to take it off somebody's hands would be a big four or a big US bank or whatever it is. So I guess it will run its course a little bit that way. But going back to the sort of application of tech, I mean, we talk about, if you're talking about a new industry, I guess the way it's unfolded is there need to be reasons for things to happen. So if fintech as an industry didn't exist, the big banks wouldn't even have thought about doing things like open APIs. for example, and opening up access to stuff. Now they're probably doing it against their instincts, but it is happening. And even when you take that far enough, we've talked about things like, could a cash machine be done differently, where it's part of a whole network of old things that still happens, to take the money you put in the machine and apply it to an account further down. There's all sorts of security layers that probably don't need to be there anymore. And could you turn that into just a dumb machine that speaks to open APIs in the background with some identification through a phone, for example? That's the sort of thing that is happening. And it wouldn't happen unless challengers were trying to knock on the door of these things to reduce their costs of setting up. I do think they will end up being swallowed eventually, because that's what happens. But as long as there's a way of people entering the market that wasn't there before to innovate and try and grab some customers away and see what happens, that's the disruption that keeps it spinning, isn't it?
It's interesting. I wrote an article on our blog a while back about DeFi in the cryptocurrency space in relation to fintech and in relation to large-scale financial services organizations as well. There's a perception within the sort of fintech community that that the traditional sort of financial services organizations have kind of got it wrong. And then there's a kind of perception in DeFi that even fintechs who are trying to disrupt aren't actually delivering proper disruption. And so there's this kind of sort of continuum of people who believe they're disrupting things. I'm sure people in, a big four bank think they're disrupting things right the way through down to someone with a bedroom project trying to prove out a new protocol on a blockchain somewhere thinks they're disrupting things. My thing that I always think about is how that merges, like over that continuum, how things like meet up and create something that's actually got scale and can be used and delivers ultimately better customer outcomes. Because there's always been in the financial services world sort of asymmetries that have benefited centralized organizations. Of course, we know that, but like you think about, we're never going to go fully decentralized, because how could we? And we're never going to go fully to the sort of the hilt of where fintech might take us, because it's potentially too risky, it potentially isn't regulated enough, etc., etc. So things have to come from the best kind of ideas in the idea space right the way up to where they might have scale. And I think that's the interesting bit, is the ideas that come up through cryptocurrency, smart contracts, decentralized finance, through fintech, and then hit the network effect of mainstream adoption. That's where things start to get interesting. This idea that like banks are going to crumble because decentralized finance exists is absolutely ludicrous in some respects.
My favorite analyst of these things, Benedict Evans, has been on a bit of a rant about this in the last month. Not about crypto specifically or DeFi specifically. We should probably explore what DeFi actually means, but that's another whole thing. If you look at Wikipedia, it either means a short acronym for defiance, or it means decentralized finance. You can take your pick. It probably means both, in truth. Benedict Evans has made the correct assumption that if the layman tried to get into DeFi at the minute, they would get stuck, because it's quite cumbersome to even understand what you're signing up to. And that has been the case for most things in technology disruption. It's only really taken off when somebody made it easier to do. And the somebody that will make it easier to do will probably be an incumbent with the power to reach lots of people and sort of turn it into something aggregated, which isn't really what it's meant to be in the first place, and possibly regulated, which it tries hard not to be. So there is probably a cycle of disruption where people are quite willing to put up with things, such as our very first podcast. It's a complete tangent, by the way, but it's applicable. First thing we talked about, if I remember right, was Wix, and the fact that anybody can pretty much make a website now, where and they do. Wix, Squarespace, all sorts of things. People just make stuff, or they put it on Facebook, whatever. They publish. Where 25 years ago, you would have to have found an account, found web space, which people used to tell me the government should pay for. And you had to find how to learn code to write some pages. It's quite cumbersome, which is why webmasters had to be masters of lots of things. To me, it's similar now. If you and then that got aggregated and easier eventually. It's the same for finance. If somebody makes something easier to do, even if that means centralizing it in the old-fashioned way, regulating it to make it safe and understandable, so be it. But that's probably where most of this ends up. Doesn't mean to say there won't be things being disrupted in front of that, because there always will be, like we've just talked about with healthcare. But I don't think there'll be mass adoption of some of the stuff we talk about in crypto and decentralized finance until the average Joe can understand how to use it.
Well, it's interesting, and again, this is me taking us off on a tangent, which probably will just end up us going over the 30-minute mark again. But I was reading an article last night about MoonPay, who are offering a custodial service for celebrities to onboard themselves into the world of crypto, and there was a discussion about it that why do they need this? Why it's not that difficult? Why and it's like, when people are in the space, they think, oh, this is like, the UX is great, it's dead easy, it's dead simple. But actually, none of that is true. And, if you are Post Malone or Jimmy Fallon or whoever else has bought a Bored Ape NFT recently, you want to buy a piece of digital art for 200,000 US dollars. But you have to convert 200,000 US dollars into a cryptocurrency. You have to get that into a wallet. You have to agree, and probably an over-the-counter deal rather than a deal through a traditional open marketplace with someone who's already an owner. All of this stuff, and then you have to store it somewhere that you trust, and put all the relevant security measures in place so it's not hackable, broadly speaking. So whether that's in a cold storage device or wherever it might be. And the point I was making was like, this stuff's difficult, right? For the layman, this stuff is difficult. And the idea that in the world of DeFi or in the world of fintech, that you're going to get mass adoption just because it's a good idea. It's like, it has to be easy, really easy, and really secure. And really just a no-brainer, because actually some people, and I know family members that are like this, they're like, oh, I've had the same bank account since I was 18. I really can't be bothered opening up a second bank account. It's like, that's the kind of inertia that you're dealing with,
But everything you've just described, and if you want a tangent, this is a real strange one, but the sort of things you've just described as barriers, you could easily say are the same things that the East India Company hit in 1600, trying to bring things back through the Silk Roads and stuff. I mean, security, because there was piracy on the roads, you had to find currency, you had to understand who you were trading with, and the regulations of the market. It's exactly the same. Everything just hinges on creating the conditions to perform an activity. That one of the things I was thinking about with this, in my previous company, we had a website that didn't really trade on subscriptions or anything. It was easy content to find on Google and read. Therefore, nobody wanted to pay for it, which is traditional in all web publishing, to be honest. And there are many things. Coil is the most famous one, where people pay by subscription through sites that adopt that platform. So if you're reading a website that is part of the Coil network, the website gets paid in Ethereum for every hour you spend reading it, just by using the site. And all you have to do is have a plugin in Chrome that's really easy to do. There is some adoption because not everybody uses plugins, but it's fairly trivial to do. And the site gets paid just by you being there. Now, the flip side of that is most sites don't understand how to collect the money. So in Coil, and it's probably one of their bigger problems, the people who sign up to it have to then convert the crypto money that they're paid in, and even how to receive it is pretty messy, and then get it out to a traditional bank account so you can pay people's wages with it. There are things in front of that I'm willing to bet there's a lot of money on deposit in that service that people who are strapped just can't get at. That's where the adoption kind of fails, actually, where people can't trade with it. But yeah, there are no new problems in any of this, as we keep saying. It's just
well, interestingly, to leave everyone on a meme. The other day, I saw someone had posted a meme, and it said, "Everyone says, imagine what." How much a person from the 1400s mind would be blown if you showed them the internet today. And the second half of the meme was, they'd actually have their mind more blown by this, and it was just a picture of the spice aisle, the spice rack aisle in Tesco. I was like,
there are fascinating books about shipping networks and how the world is basically set up to protect the seas one way or the other, because for the last 400 years, pirates robbed the world of trade. And you apply that principle to just about anything we talk about, to be perfectly honest, but it's all good.
This is it. Well, thank you so much for your time again. I think we've definitely gone over 30 minutes, but hopefully not too much. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to find out more about Waracle, you can find us at waracle.com, at Waracle UK, on our social channels. And until next time, thank you so much for listening.